Thanks a lot. In my talk, I want to take you to some of the places of the peri-urban where I think, and many other scholars think, they are so dynamic and we must pay even more attention in trying to understand how cities are growing. And I argue in this talk that while there's a wide literature on the peri-urbanization, of the peri-urban, the conceptual debate actually what is the difference of peri-urban to urban, and especially what is the difference of processes of peri-urbanization versus urbanization, is rarely considered. And I draw here on a paper which I've published in the Journal of Geography Compass, which was a really nice, I think, a really nice endeavor to write, and I can only motivate you to also engage with that journal, where I'm also now part of the editorial board, so I can really motivate you for that journal. I argue that in terming all these processes at the peri-urban as peri-urbanization, it's a process of universalizing, right? So whatever we see kind of at the urban fringe, whatever of these huge diversities we see at the rural-urban edge, this rural to urban transformation we are seeing, we're calling them often peri-urbanization. Yeah? And in doing that, we put a signifying with the peri that it seems to be different than urbanization. But my question is, what is the difference, and why are scholars doing that, and what's that concept about? So I offer here a critical review of some of the southern geographies of peri-urbanization. And what I want to do is I will identify different conceptual vectors of that peri-urban, which I think is important to understand that the peri in peri-urbanization is actually an umbrella concept bringing together multiple theoretical concepts. It's not just one concept, it's multiple concepts which we have. Probably you have all seen this map or similar maps of the huge difference in the level of urbanization, which greatly varies on a global scale, while, let's say, urbanization, this story is largely told for global north countries, Europe and North America. The dynamics which we see, and also the big difference which we see is especially in global south countries, in Africa, but also in Asia. And let's say in Asia, 50%, that's kind of the figures we have, 50% of the people by now live in urban areas, however you want to define them, there's a big debate of that. But Africa definitely is still predominantly rural when we talk about population. So, and there are regional differences also on these two continents, if we just look at them. The story of Latin America is also mostly told. It's a different history of urbanization, closely connected to the Spanish and Portuguese colonial times, so much higher rates of urbanization. But a country like India, maybe about a third, numbers is also, again, debatable. There's still, let's say, a lot of scope also for urbanization, and when we look into kind of the figures of the future, we see that these global urban geographies are shifting, right? So when we look at it, we see that future urban growth is definitely a phenomenon of the global south. Yeah? In North America, Europe, there's not much happening. Latin America, a little bit, but it will mainly be a focus on the global south. India alone will have 400 million new urban residents by 2050. 400 million. Yeah? And even a country of a much smaller size like Kenya, where I've been also working and showing you some insights from, Kenya will have 30 million more people living in urban areas by 2050. that means they will double the number of people living in urban areas. So these are kind of the dynamics which we face. And there has been a study by Gao and O'Neill in 2020 published in Nature Communications, and they project that in countries like India or Kenya, the size of the city, the territory of cities, will grow by 5 times until 2100. And I think this is enough motivation to study kind of processes of urbanization in these countries. And Rihanna Allen, one of the, I would say, most eminent and famous scholars on the topic of the peri-urban, outlined that from her understanding, the sustainability battle of the future will actually be told and fought in these new areas, right? Because there we can still change the pathways of development. And it's maybe much easier than changing already existing structures. And that is also where, what she says, where the city's appropriation and transformation of nature's nutrient cycle manifests most intensely. Be it the brick making, be it the sand mining, be it other kind of resource extraction. Much of this, as you told before, is happening especially in these peri-urban areas. So, and then, I mean, some of you know these pictures because, I mean, this is joint work I was happy to be part of with Saurabh Chakraborty and Priyank Patel and others here, looking at Delhi. And I mean, while there's much debate about new cities, satellite cities, and so on, much of this growth will happen around already large megacities, urban agglomeration. Like we have also shown here, for Delhi, in about 2 decades, the urban core area of Delhi increased by 75%. So it's also getting more dense, these cities, but they're also spreading into the peri-urban. And this is joint work with Priyank Patel and Saurabh Chakraborty, still under review, where we have been trying to picture and trying to identify different pathways of urbanization, trying to understand and trying to make the argument that peri-urbanization or urbanization at the fringe, at the edge, is not happening everywhere in the same manner. There are different dynamics. There are very heterogeneous pathways in which these cities develop. We have done, and I was fortunate also to be part of that, we have done that also for Kolkata, and shown, was it me? And actually shown that there are very complex patterns of urban growth, yeah, especially in these peri-urban areas. And this is just to give you some insights, some pictures also. I mean, these 2 pictures from my fieldwork in Faridabad, south of Delhi, and Thika, which is near Kenya's capital city, Nairobi, so about 30 kilometers out of Nairobi. They are somehow characteristic for what I understand is the peri-urban. And they are emblematic for these current urbanization processes in many parts of Africa and Asia, I would argue. What do we see here? Well, I think, first of all, down here, agricultural fields. In the Kenyan picture, some grassy lands fragmented by building structures. Yeah. Do these look typically urban or rural? Who would say it's more rural and who would say that's urban? Urban or urban? Who's for urban? Who's for rural? Who's for peri-urban? Okay, cool. Right? Good. I mean, you see the contradictions, right? And well, these kinds of agricultural fields we would typically describe to be pretty rural, right? But these multi-story buildings there, they don't look like village houses, right? They look pretty urban already. And same here in the Kenyan cases, these huge boundary walls dotted around these former agricultural fields. That was actually a pineapple plantation earlier, and turned now into a residential community step by step. So these walled properties and structures, they also don't look like typical rural houses in Kenya. Right? They're pretty urban in the way they appear. So they show a typical mix of both urban and rural elements, or what is generally termed the peri-urban, indicating that there's urban growth taking place in a very different way than, and that is a very important argument, I think, that urbanization has been going on in Europe and North America. You will not find kind of these pictures, also not historically in this way, from Europe or Latin America. These plotted developments, which I think are very emblematic, very typical for what we see in the peri-urban in Kenya and India and also in other countries. And I think this is connected to the fact that much of urbanization in Europe, or later also in North America, and especially in Europe, was closely related to industrialization. And that is generally not the case. There are some exceptions, right? But that is generally not the case in the processes of urbanization we see in southern countries today, right? So this employment core of the industrial revolution with that settlements close to the factories, etc., which kind of kicked off urbanization, that's not there. Instead, we see often this urbanization without industrialization, which has occurred in many countries. And I think we must keep that in mind also when we think about theories describing these processes. And for sure, there has been a huge part of that growth is taking place informally, unplanned, right? So turning this into more and more urban, but at the same time as we don't have industrialization, sure, there's the service sector and so on, but nevertheless, both in Kenya and in India, agriculture remains the backbone of the economy, especially also in those places. Yeah. So in that way, it remains still often an important source of livelihood. When you talk to farmers in Faridabad, same in Kenya, well, this land has been sold, but other places, sure, agriculture still plays an important role. My current work, especially in and around Chennai, here in the southern parts of Chennai, shows similar developments, while here, especially due to land speculation, you hardly find agriculture anymore. These lands have been sold to middlemen and then resold, etc., also to the large development companies you all know, the Casa Grande, DLFs, etc. And either these companies or other companies selling to them were now sitting on that land speculating for 10, 15, 20 years sometimes, holding on to that land and bringing it now when kind of the urbanization comes to these places in southern Chennai on the market for real estate developments. So I think in this introduction, I would like to highlight that we have these shifting global geographies of urbanization, and there's a need, because of that shift, to decenter global urban theory, and that needs new vocabularies. That's the whole talk about urban theories from the global south. Because urbanization is happening much different than what we have seen in Europe or North America, which for me and for others clearly means we also need new theories, right? We cannot explain what we see here with kind of old theories from the north. And that's what Ren and others have called the peripheral turn in global urban studies, right? So there's much more work, and colleagues here are working on that, on small and medium cities coming up now, on secondary cities, right? And the periphery of these mega cities. Earlier work has focused on central parts of Delhi, or central parts of Mumbai, etc. Right? So this shift is both towards periphery when we think of global, right? But it's not focusing on Los Angeles anymore as kind of the prototype city. It's focusing on Lusaka or Kolkata, right? So that's a first peripheral shift, and then to the peri-urban of these cities. But it also presents distinct challenges for research because of its dynamic, especially, and also accessibility, right? You often have to travel a long way from your office, from your place of residence to study these places, yeah, because they remain to some extent peripheral. And at the same time, when we look at the international literature on peri-urban, and I put here from all disciplines, and then especially from the environmental and social sciences, it seems to be a hype to talk about the peri-urban, and also about using the term peri-urbanization. So since the early 2000s, there's really huge increase on work on peri-urban and peri-urbanization. And David Simon, scholar from the UK, he put it that way, that he said, the term peri-urbanization has acquired global relevance. Nevertheless, its diverse applications defy elaborate theorizations. And that was some of the motivation for digging deeper into that concept and to see what do we understand in that. So the key questions, which I put in the beginning already, is what is urbanization, what distinguishes it from urbanization, and why do authors use the term peri-urbanization instead of just calling it urbanization? And why is the current use of the term problematic in my eyes? And then how to re-theorize these geographies of peri-urbanization in the studies. So I will a little bit of critical review the use of the terminology of peri-urbanization, and then identify three what I call conceptual vectors of the peri-urban, the territorial, the functional, and the transitional. And then sketch out that, from my perspective, we should understand peri-urbanization as an umbrella concept which kind of captures many different theoretical approaches, and outline then in the last step some of what I think rich and diverse conceptual formations are already there, which we can use to make sense of what we see in the peri-urban. So I go along these three questions and four steps now in the rest of the talk. We have, I think, covered most of that. So the peri-urban is a territory around the city. That's from the Greek word peri, meaning around, near. And it's a mosaic-like landscape of rural parts, urban parts, lifestyles, livelihoods, and so on. And the peri-urbanization would then be a process, urbanization. So it's a process, meaning it's a transformation from predominantly rural to a mix of rural and urban. And I want to highlight that. For me, the peri-urbanization terminology, the core of the concept, is that process from rural to a mix of rural and urban. If it would go directly to urban, we should call it urbanization, right? So, and I think that distinguishes here. It's maybe playing around with words a little bit, but I think it has a beginning, and I want to outline it. And it clearly denotes urbanization processes beyond existing boundaries or existing urban limits. And these are complex and multifaceted. You can maybe summarize the last 2 points. But if we now look into the definitions of some of, let's say, one of maybe some eminent, but also some younger colleagues here, John Friedman, in an article 2016, defined it in a way. So he said, peri-urbanization is a shorthand expression for the transformative processes that take place in the areas surrounding large cities. So I would argue, well, if that is peri-urbanization, why don't you call it urbanization? Yeah? Webster, in work mainly on China and East Asia, he refers to a process in which rural areas located on the outskirts of established cities become more urban in character, in physical, economic, and also social terms, often in piecemeal fashion. Okay, now I would also say, well, you could also call it urbanization or piecemeal urbanization. But again, I'm not really convinced of kind of the additional value of calling it peri-urban. Lara Bartels, a friend and colleague from Germany, and her work is based on Ghana, he put it a little more precise, I would say, as a process where in a spatially and temporally non-linear and non-uniform manner, a peri-urban gradient between the urban fringe and the rural hinterland of cities is produced, which might become incorporated into the urban concentration in the future, yet they maintain a dynamic peri-urban flux over many years. I see a lot of merit in this. I find very relevant definition because it highlights these temporalities, but also that it's not predetermined whether this will become urban proper at some point of time. Maybe it remains in that mix. And then to also cover the debate a little bit from Latin America in Mendes Lemos et al. On Mexico Road, the process of transformation of the social, economic, and political, organizational, physical, and natural endorsement from rural to more urban of the periphery of urban areas due to urban expansion. So there I would again say, okay, if that is urban expansion, then just call it urban expansion. What do we know? So I would say, except for that definition by Bartels, and sure, this is just picking 4 out of probably a couple hundreds of definitions we could find, but it's for me quite typical that they are often used interchangeably with urbanization. And why, if we look into that literature a little deeper, for me the question was why? Why are then authors referring to peri-urbanization and not just calling it urbanization? And I think it's not straightforward, and I'm sure, I mean, you can't talk to everybody and ask, but I think it's important to think about it, why they make this choice and refer to peri-urbanization. The first is just a territorial marker. They just indicate that it's outside kind of urban limits. That's happening at the edge. Theoretically, conceptually, there's no added value in that, I would argue. The second part of, or second group of authors, they highlight that's the process. They want to highlight that's process-based, this transitional understanding of the peri-urban. And these works often view peri-urban as not quite urbanization. Bluntly speaking, I would say these are authors which choose to refer to peri-urbanization to some extent avoid calling it urbanization, because for them it's not proper urbanization. There's something wrong with this, right? This unplanned, haphazard, things like that, informal, right? So they refrain from calling it urbanization, and they use the berry as a marker that is different from the norm. And the norm would be the global north, these concepts of how urbanization should happen, right? So in that way, they distinguish, because it doesn't look like, yeah, what they would expect as proper processes of urbanization. And this I find problematic, right? Because they are not engaging in such with the concept, but they're having it as a marker to some extent. And I see a risk there that this reproduces certain stigmas of third world urbanization, yeah, global south urbanization as being different and not the real urbanization, what we want to see, right? And this is highly problematic. And in that way, I think there are authors out who are implicitly differentiating between this normal, regular, proper urbanization in the north and southern urbanization as kind of also the other form of urbanization, not fitting into urban models, urban theories, which we have, which originate from the south. Yeah, and that brings me to the question, what counts as urban in these theories, in global urban theory? And I think that is then maybe the third group. The third group of authors, and I would associate my work most closely probably with that third group, emphasizes that these transformations are empirically different from processes of urbanization in northern cities. So they also take it as a marker to some extent, but more from the empirical side, right? And start from there and developing the argument from there. And so I would say in this one, in this notion, it's not about being unplanned or haphazard or whatever. It's more about that the question, how can we engage with these spaces, right? But I would argue that the first and the second is kind of dominating much of the literature on peri-urbanization, which we find. And I think that is alarmingly, because it does, much of that work does not engage with the question, what distinguishes urbanization from peri-urbanization. And rather, peri-urbanization is often distinctly marked as being inherently problematic. Yeah? It's always seen as problematic due to its unplanned and haphazard character. Right? And I want to argue here for that we accept also that these processes of organic urban growth are kind of the natural way cities also grow, right? And when we see that the population grows, when we know that cities will grow that much in the next decades, we have to also accept that to a certain extent. And in theorizing that, I would argue, let's look at it with kind of three interrelated conceptual layers. And the first one is for me the classical territorial. That goes back to the work of McGee, McGee's Desakota. He later then distinguished between Desakota and peri-urban. We spare that, it gets too complicated, right? But it's territorially demarcating the peri-urban as a zone around the city. Right? And I would say most scholars stop here. For them, it's just a territorial marker. And I would argue there's more to it. I mean, did some drawings for sure, it makes it complicated because you have that also in a polycentric urban agglomeration, so it's not that easy. And then you have sometimes a differentiation between peri-urban and urban fringe, etc., etc. I spare you that also today. So let's keep that in mind, that it's a territorial category around the city, and it is derived, the concept is derived from empirical findings from southern cities especially. There's been early works on peri-urban places in Africa from the 1960s. Parallel to that, there has been also debate in France and in other European countries about the peri-urban as a category. But I would say the literature of the South is very much kind of coming from that early work which looked into this mosaic-like landscape and livelihoods, and that is telling us a story about a mix of rural and urban, which we have not seen in Europe or North America. And that is very, very important. So empirically different, an empirically different territory. The second is a functional category. There are these flows and interaction, linkages, flows of people, goods, ideas, etc., between the urban and the rural and the peri-urban in between, right? The ecosystem services, the resources, and so on. And we must understand it both as a territory and as functionally linked to the city. I mapped just a few here: people, goods, transport infrastructure, food supply, resource flows, but not only in that way, it goes also the other way. Much of the urban waste is going into the peri-urban. Yeah? It has also a function of an urban city, yeah, of the waste. Just think about, I think here especially the East Coqueta wetlands and other places, right? So these are the places that have come to many, many very, very dirty, very, very environmentally degraded peri-urban areas because of these flows and connections to urban areas. So these are the two, and the third is the transitional. So there's this idea that both the physical and material transformation is happening there, but also transformation of governance system, institutional frameworks of the peri-urban, which are also in flux. And interestingly, these scholars who understand the peri-urban more as a transitional, they are not really interested also in demarcating it territorially. Right? For them, it doesn't make sense whether it stops here or it stops there. It's in flux anyway. So if we visit the same place in a couple of years, the boundaries are shifting all the time. Yeah? If they are existing at all. So for them, it's really the transition. And it's also, as Friedman put it in this 2016 article, he said, like, it's just, we can only look at the moment of time, right? So we have to see that at this specific moment. But what is much more interesting, I feel, is looking at these processes. And these scholars, which look at it more as a transitional category, they also use especially qualitative approaches, yeah, interviews, ethnography, etc., to study these transforming governance processes, these changing institutional frameworks. And we have a couple of also theoretical concepts that whether it's like these overlapping jurisdictions, which some scholars call legal pluralism, right? We have rural and urban institutions kind of, and then you have different layers of that competing also, but also you have maybe institutional voids where nobody is really taking responsibility. And yeah, I think in this perspective, we can distinguish then two more perspectives. I think there's one perspective which is very place-based, which looks at, for example, the peri-urban with the lands of the commons, yeah, common lands, yeah. In Chennai, people talk about Porombo land, right? Government land on the one hand, but these were all commons, right? So these commons is Vishal Narayan's work, Summit Beach work, and others here, especially in India and also in Gurgaon and other places. So the commons as a play space. And then there's this global political economy perspective by Goldman, Lucas, and others who look at it, especially through that investment, financialization, empty islands, and look at these global local flows, right? But I think both have this transitional understanding of the period as the city yet to come, or not yet proper urban. Yeah. And also there's this understanding of urban in the making and zone in transition. Yeah. But it remains kind of that that conceptual point of view, and that's maybe also a disclaimer of my work, and I think it's a valid critique. I definitely look at it still from a very urban perspective. We could also turn around this whole debate and look from the rural. How does the peri-urban look from a rural perspective? I think much of this literature, all three vectors, and I think that's true. I mean, that there is a city coming, right, as in this picture here. We look at it often very much from the urban perspective, and I think we as scholars, we are urged kind of to also think about it more from trying to look at it with some rural eyes, trying to understand what is going on there. And then we can maybe even tell a different story. And importantly, sure, that has nothing to do with administrative boundaries, right? Whether it's Delhi, Chennai, Kolkata, these processes don't care about administrative boundaries, right? They stretch across. I have summarized that in that article. I can't go into detail there. I think it's important to, if you read about peri-urbanization, to ask yourself which of these three, maybe there are more vectors, yeah, maybe you find some more, the authors are actually referring to, and to what extent do they relate their work more to processes, territories, or these relational aspects. To what extent are they interested in, and I mean that is valid, and we have also worked on that, trying to define the peri-urban and so on, and to what extent that doesn't make any difference for other authors, right? And so if you read about the peri-urban, people write about completely different spaces, completely different places. One is really at the edge, and the other is kind of far out, like 30, 40 kilometers out. I know work by colleagues, Carsten Butch and others, a German colleague who have been working on that Mumbai Pune stretch. And they talk about the peri-urban being out some 50 kilometers out of the city, right? And others right at the border. And sure, I mean, whether you are 50 kilometers out of Pune or 50 kilometers out of Pune makes a huge difference in the processes you see, the dynamics you see, right? So it's not a homogeneous category, this peri-urban. And for that, I worked a bit in Faridabad in the last years, and again using especially graphics from Saraf here to introduce you also to that place. Faridabad, south of Delhi, which is a city growing massively, or has been growing massively in the last 2 decades. And so what I'm always trying is I'm combining these remote sensing analysis with colleagues with qualitative social science fieldwork, trying to integrate these two perspectives. What do we see in Faridabad? We had different phases of growth when we look at the city scale between 2019 and 1991, so after economic liberalization took really off there, until 2009 we had a more internal growth which was still oriented along kind of the railway and the highway towards Agra, and along it was not kind of going over the Agra Canal to the east. But then with the new development plan for the east of Faridabad, it jumped over the canal since 2010 and is now rapidly developing towards the east. That's the development plan for that area to the east, and then there's a new peripheral road coming, a new ring road, you can say. And so we spent lots of days with research and talking to government officials, planners, Saluda, Haryana Urban Development Authority. So that's where that research is based on, especially qualitative interviews with different actors from the field. And we look then here at a transect along this road, which is called the Kerry Road. And this field work distinguished for us two distinct peri-urban morphologies, as we called it. And these are what the locals in Faridabad called them, and they called them colonies and societies. Not sure whether this differentiation works also in Kolkata, but when you were talking with people in Faridabad and you were talking about colonies, then it was very clear that this is informal. This is self-built, right? And when we talk about societies, then it was the upper picture, right? These were the big societies. And so in this work, we could show that it's a patchwork of both. And they are closely interrelated. Domestic workers, etc. The one can't be without the other. But there are also different pathways in which they develop. So, I get a glimpse of that from that map, but it was very clear that the areas where you found the brick making, for example, these were areas which turned later into informal colonies because they were filled with debris, waste, etc. Big developers were not interested in these places. They were also smaller in shape, right? And the big developers, they looked for that big chunks of land. So when they could not assemble larger pieces, because there was this brick making involved in between and other activities, they stayed away from it. And what we also could show clearly is that there's a development plan and there's a, see that mouse here, yeah? There's this boundary of the development plan, and this has been earlier up to here, and then they extended the planning areas. But they extended it only, I mean, you could say maybe too late for planning because the colonies have already come up. Yeah? And in Gautam Barnes' words, they have been then, from a government side point of view, made informal by the state. With the plan which was superposed on an area which was already settled. Right? So informality, in the words of Ananya Roy, produced by the state, not by the people. Yeah? And this was something where I would argue we can only understand when we look at it from a multi-temporal perspective. Yeah? And seeing these different logics coming together. This, and I could only give you a small glimpse of that, is one of the works I use to identify what I call kind of key processes of the peri-urban. And this is, for me, I mean, the dominant process which is talked about is the displacement of agriculture by housing. Yeah, housing, residential is the big kind of, the big driver. Yeah. And the connected speculation of land. But there's also a lot of displacement of self-built incremental housing by large-scale infrastructure developments. So some of these colonies, always depending on vote bank politics, etc., you know the game better than me, is in a constant danger of getting displaced by large-scale infrastructure developments. These were, in the Faridabad case, old, very old, informal slum-like settlements along the Agra Canal, which were demolished to create a new bikers road. Then there's this transformation of exploited resource extraction areas, the brick kilns, for example, into self-built incremental housing, this plotting urbanism, plot by plot. The expansion of research extraction, so one brick making, next brick making, and so on. The peripherization of agriculture. I think that's a topic for itself. I mean, agriculture is pushed out, but there's more happening to that. You see processes of intensification, commercialization, high value crops, yeah, which you can sell now on the local market because you have a whole new base of middle class people moving into these societies, and people in colonies also, right? So there's a huge market also for these higher value products, especially also milk products, but also meat, chicken, and so on, right? So you see there are also a lot of changes, what I have summarized here as agriculture. And now, wrapping it together, I would argue that all this, and probably some other processes, is area urbanization. So it's not just building more and more urban structures. It's a whole set of these complex processes coming together in the area. And that, for me, makes up this process of area urbanization. So it's much more than what we would generally consider as urbanization. And that's why I argue with these three conceptual vectors, we can distinguish more clearly between processes of area urbanization and urbanization. We can avoid, at least to some extent, the risk of kind of reproducing these stigmas of third world, not the right, not the proper urbanization. And we can re-theorize from that these processes, which I have just outlined 6. But I clearly stay away from calling it a single concept. Yeah? It's for me an umbrella. It cannot sufficiently theorize the multiplicity of rural to urban transformation in the South. Rather, I suggest that it's an umbrella concept and it's rather a phenomenon which might be universal. You see peri-urban areas in Kenya and in India. You see them around the big city centers, both cities. So the phenomenon is universal. But the causal explanations why peri-urban areas come into being and how they transfer and how dynamic they need to vary. So the peri-urbanization, in my eyes, can never be one theory, one concept, but it's always a must to have multiple concepts in multiple and different setups to explain that. Yeah? So we need multiple situated conceptualization which engage with the urban periphery in the global south. So I think we can draw there on the already existing peri-urban literature, and we can draw on these new vocabularies and concepts from the south, and also northern derived theories and concepts. I would argue that there are places in the peri-urban of the south, in India or in Kenya, which share a lot with suburban communities in Los Angeles, right? But there are other places which are completely different. So I'm not saying let's get rid of all the theories we have, but take out what fits, but also critically engage with that. And I think there's lots out there, and there's the concept of bypass urbanization coming from work by Soldier and others in this planetary urbanization school from Christian Schmid and Niall Brenner. I could make now a big disclaimer what's problematic with that term. I leave that, right? But I think there's merit in that lots of processes are bypassing communities, are bypassing resources, are bypassing in terms of not only transport, but if we take in an example from Faridabad, you had huge new rainy belts put in place to bring water into the societies. The hand pumps of the colonies for drought. And so the pipeline is actually bypassing these colonies. They have no access to that water. And they even lose their access from that hand of seeing the pouring of deeper and deeper wells in the colonies. So, and we see that in Indian cities. I mean, the new ring road in Chennai, where I work, maybe, creates new centralities. Yeah? It is bypassing lots of communities, it is bypassing, and it's also the urbanization kind of jumps out to this ring road, right? Because of accessibility and transport. And I think metro systems, the introduction of new metro lines brings a similar effect. Then there's this concept of plotting urbanization, where you have that plot by plot incremental development, especially in the colonies I was talking about. But we see these plots also here in Pudupaka, and flying into Kolkata, I could see them. You always think, okay, cool, they set up a new small race course or something like that, right? It looks like that. You have these nice, polished bumpers and everything, right? And you can buy these plots. So this plotting development is something which is, I think there are first works on that, but it's completely under theorized. And what I find interesting, and that's another example of how flexible then the big developers like DLF and so on are, is that's a project also in Pudupaka. On the other side of the road of this project, there's a big DLF project. And here DLF was sitting on that land with sister companies and so on for some 15 years, even more. And I mean, you see that shape of the land there, and you already kind of can imagine that, okay, that guy here was not willing to sell. Yeah? Or DLF was not willing to pay the price in the end. I don't know. But they adjusted. They had plans for high-rise, towers, integrated township. And what they did, DLF is now going into plot development. Right? So they have that land and they put it on the market with the plots. And they just construct villas. So there's this part of the process. And then there's a scholarship which I'm talking about a little earlier with a rural perspective, right? So this agrarian urbanism, Sai Balakrishnan's work. I can highly recommend this book, Shareholder Cities, which really looks at it, also between Pune and Mumbai especially, looks into it from the view of villages and farmers, and how they, especially also elite farmers, how they are kind of an important player in urbanization processes. Same we have from Latin America with the concept of extended urbanization. I'm just using these, the global suburbanism project, and also the infrastructure development, or the speculative urbanism I go. I would say there's so many concepts out there. I think these are some of the maybe most dominant and most relevant concepts from my perspective to theorize the area. But that would be my call. Let's call it the area, but let's forget about one theory describing that. We need multiple concepts in understanding what is going on, so we can put them all together and see what fits maybe best to describe, to explain peri-urbanization processes in Kolkata, in Chennai, in Shanghai, whatever, right? But let's get critical about peri-urbanization as a phenomenon and not as kind of a theoretical concept as such. And I think that's really looking forward. I would say they do not demonstrate uniform morphologies, and they always give also the expression of broader political, economic contexts and local and national planning norms and distributional politics. So in that way, we also need comparative work from different countries, from different cities, to see which government settings, which processes create which kinds of peri-urban spaces. And that's where I'm coming to now. Thanks a lot.